Let's start off with a truth that's self-evident to every human being living on this plane right now. We are born with senses, and without those senses to interpret the world around us, we would die a most painful death. Now, those senses are meant to be trusted. Otherwise, those senses would not exist. They would not serve the function of keeping us alive. So, with that being stated, can we all not agree that those senses are unequivocally fundamental in understanding the world in which we are presented? And with that being said, fundamentally, we should trust these senses above all things. So, with that as the fundamental foundation, we shall continue. When people like myself make the assertion that the earth is flat, we commit a grave mistake when it comes to entering the realm of debate. When we make a claim such as this, the burden of proof automatically gets pushed upon us, simply due to the fact that it makes the art of debating us that much easier. However, I am going to address this from the complete opposite side of the equation. I am going to assert that you are making the claim that we live on a spherical planet flying through space with gravity, whether it be Newtonian or Einsteinian, which we'll address in a few minutes. You making that claim must provide the extraordinary evidence to back up said extraordinary claim. Now let's get back to the foundations that every human being lays their lives on every day when they get out of bed. Our senses. Experiment shows us over and over again that it is impossible for us to have a pressurized system without a container. Now you can test this over and over again by taking a pressurized box to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. When that box is placed in that environment, that box is crushed due to the water pressure being exerted on that box and the difference in pressure between that box and the outside force. Now, if you bring that box to sea level, the pressure on the inside and outside will be about equal. Therefore, there might be a pressure exerted on the box, however, it will stay intact. Now, if you bring that same box to the outer edge of our atmosphere, said box will expand and explode just like a weather balloon when it reaches a certain altitude because of the difference in pressure. Now, this demonstrates unequivocally that we live inside a density chamber. Now, the only way that we as human beings can demonstrate this on our plane is to take a vacuum artificially created by human beings and start messing with pressure and density and buoyancy and all of that. And I choose to use pressure, density, and buoyancy instead of the word gravity because gravity depends on a variable called weight. Now, gravity itself is a variable. You can prove neither of these variables. Therefore, I'm going to rely on Occam's razor and refer to gravity as pressure, density, and buoyancy, all of which are dependent on the fluid dynamics, of the density chamber we live in. Now, this is all demonstratable on a daily basis and repeatable over and over again. Nothing you have ever seen in your entire life in the natural environment. Now, by natural, I mean uninfluenced by man. Man had no effect on it being on this plane. So everything that was here without our interference, including ourselves, is natural. The natural world will never show you an example of a density chamber existing without a barrier. Therefore, one must assume, based on the observations that every human being makes every day, nobody's ever witnessed anything that contradicts this in the natural world, nobody. So one must conclude that we live inside of a density chamber with a barrier. Now, this is a fundamental truth. Something that you should not be able to argue with based on logic. Okay, so there's number one. Absolutely, you have to disprove what I just stated in order for us to be spinning on a globe, which inevitably will make me question the entire model in which you present. Now, you run into another problem when you start bringing up the fact that you're making the extraordinary claim of spin, rotation. Spin, rotation, the Coriolis effect, however you want to refer to it, has never been detected. Let's go back to the fundamental foundations that we as a human being have. We have never, in our entire experience upon this plane, observed the force of spin, nor have we seen any evidence in any experiment that one has tried to conjure in order to explain this. Now, globers, in an effort to prove spin, will constantly throw out experiments such as the Morrison-Morley experiment, Airy's failure, and the Foucault pendulum. Now, these are the three experiments that they'll throw out over and over again. The Foucault pendulum relies on way too many variables and also will not make a complete rotation without man-made assistance. So in other words, the Foucault pendulum nowadays is driven on an electric gear in order to make its full rotation. If the Earth was spinning, you should see everything that's being suspended from a string performing the Foucault pendulum experiment 24/7. However, this is not the case. Therefore, the Foucault pendulum gets thrown right out the window. Airy's failure proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Earth is stationary and that the stars are moving through a substance known as the ether. Now, this experiment rocked the scientific world for years, to the point where two guys known as Morrison and Morley set out to disprove Airy's failure with their experiments. However, they failed miserably and only proved Airy's failure to be accurate. Now, there's another experiment that you yourself can do in your kitchen that will prove that the Earth is not spinning as well. And that is simply, you take a gyroscope of any kind and you set it on a rotating 24-hour clock. And as that clock is rotating, the gyroscope should detect the spin of that rotating clock. And it does. Now, if that's the case, you should be able to take that rotating base away and use the Earth as that base, and you should get half of the rotation you did with the clock being present, because there's two rotational forces. However, the gyroscope detects absolutely no motion, no rotation, no spin at all once you remove the 24-hour clock. Now, again, let's get back to the fundamental foundations that every human being has, which is their senses. If you have never sensed any motion disregarding an earthquake and natural forces that can be explained through science, okay, the cause can be explained to a reasonable extent. I'm not talking about earthquakes. I'm talking about the centrifugal force of a rotating Earth that should be constant. It's not present, ever. So, with that being determined, we must rely on Occam's razor again and state the obvious, that the Earth is not spinning. Now, let's rely on the fundamental truths that we hold to be self-evident as human beings, which is our senses. Nobody has ever observed any curvature anywhere with their naked eye, nor a telescopic device that doesn't have a wide eye lens or has been corrected for such things. Nobody has ever observed any curve anywhere at any height. It's never been demonstrated, not once in human history. Therefore, one must conclude that there is no curvature. So, let's get back to the very fundamentals of where we started this conversation. We started this conversation on the basis that people believing in the globe, making that assertion, must prove either rotation, they have to prove a pressurized system existing next to a vacuum without a barrier, and then they must prove a few other things as well. The claims that they have to prove have never been proven based on observations made by the human eye. Yes, they have to prove curvature as well, but they've never been able to. So with all of these things that are self-evident based on the human eye, how can any reasonable human being, relying on evidence that they themselves have gathered day to day, prove to themselves that the earth is anything but what it appears to be? What it appears to be based on scientific experiments that everybody can do over and over again is a flat, stationary, non-rotating, pressurized container. There's three experiments that anybody can do. A, you can't detect curvature anywhere, okay? 2, you observe density and pressure, which cannot happen outside of a container based on everything we've ever observed in the natural world, right? And 3, there is no such thing as rotation, the Coriolis effect, or an earth in motion. So with those 3 things being stated, one must conclude that A, everything that we see is flat to a certain degree. B, that we live inside of a container. And C, that container is not spinning. Now, as a flat earther, when somebody asks you, how can you as a human being state unequivocally that you know the truth? You know the truth because every observation that you have made tells you exactly where we live. And there is experiments that can be used to back this up. With these 3 experiments being present, there is no way that any person that believes in the globe could ever tell you that the scientific model that they present, called the heliocentric model, is true. All you have to do is ask them to disprove those 3 experiments. Until they can do, don't even bother debating them. And if they're willing to concede that they can't disprove those 3 experiments, you have already won the debate. Now, they run into all kinds of other problems as well. They like to use the word gravity. Gravity can be explained perfectly inside of a density chamber using nothing more than pressure, fluid dynamics, density, and buoyancy, all of which explain exactly what we observe, which they refer to as the force of gravity. Now, they don't even understand that their physics relies on 2 separate kinds of gravity, 2 theories of gravity working in conjunction with each other at the same time. Now you have the concept of Newtonian gravity and Einsteinian gravity, both of which can't plausibly be true, both of which can't possibly be true at the same time. However, there's different principles in different physics that people study to this day that contradict each other. They don't work hand in hand. They can't possibly, yet they'd like you to believe that there's 2 different branches of science using 2 different forms of gravity. Disregard science, disregard lab coats, disregard belief. You do not need belief to know that the earth is flat. A, you can demonstrate you live in a pressurized density chamber. B, you can't detect spin nor motion. And C, you can't detect curvature. It tells you everything you need to know. Anybody that's going to tell me we live on a globe first needs to disprove those 3 things because you're making an extraordinary claim. All I'm doing is relying on my senses. Therefore, the earth is flat, unequivocally, until you can prove otherwise.